Late afternoon in southern Texas. The sun drifted quietly toward the horizon, casting a scorched golden hue across parched grasslands and cracked dirt roads. The air was heavy and suffocating, broken now and then by the shrill cry of cicadas from the sparse woods behind, like nature's whisper trying to fill the silence that blanketed everything. On the edge of a forgotten town, a place most had ceased to remember, stood an old wooden cabin tucked beneath the gnarled boughs of ancient cypress trees. It was here that Sarah Martin lived alone, cut off from the world she once belonged to. At 41, Sarah had once been a U.S. Army sergeant, a fearless, steady leader who guided dozens of military working dogs through Afghanistan's mine-laced fields, where every step could be your last. To her, war wasn't just about commands and rifles. It was about loyalty, from comrades and from the dogs who looked into her eyes as if she were their whole world. Then, one smoke-filled morning shattered everything. An improvised explosive device ripped through the earth, swallowing her unit in a thunderous roar. Sarah survived, but her legs did not. And worse, she came home with something far less visible, a nightmare that clawed at her sleep each night. Echoes of screams, the sound of paws digging desperately into soil, a brave dog trying to save her before vanishing in the fire. Back in the U.S., Sarah had believed she could start over, rebuild with the man who'd sent her messages every day from home. But fate wasn't done with her. Less than 4 months after their reunion, a runaway truck ended his life in an instant. The unexpected loss was the final blow, collapsing everything she still believed in. With no war left to fight, and no one waiting for her, Sarah packed her things and left the city, slipping out of sight from friends and family, people who eventually stopped looking, unsure of what to say to someone who had lost too much. She chose the cabin on the outskirts for its solitude. No curious glances, no pity. There, the days blurred together. Mornings were for rolling her wheelchair onto the porch, sipping coffee while watching the sky. Afternoons passed with old books or writing letters she'd never send in a weathered leather journal. At night, she turned on the radio just to hear another human voice. The weekly calls from her VA counselor were short. Sarah never had much to say. She hated pity and refused to be seen as weak or broken. She didn't cry anymore. She no longer had the tears. Her mind had become its battlefield, one where PTSD gnawed at her quietly. Sudden gusts of wind startled her. Flickering lights triggered fear. In her dreams, she saw the eyes of dogs falling in gunfire. But she never spoke of it, because no one could understand. No one could feel it. Every soldier brings home a different kind of war. For Sarah, it was the war inside, the kind with no visible enemy, no clear battlefield, no comrades left to lean on. Once, she had stood tall amid explosions, giving orders with unflinching resolve. Now, beneath the quiet sky of southern Texas, she was a shadow. Not quite alive, not yet gone. And perhaps she would have stayed that way, if not for one summer evening when a faint whimper from the woods pierced the silence and awakened something inside her she thought had long since died. That faint cry hadn't yet echoed from the woods, but Sarah Martin's life had already settled into a rhythm of quiet, steady and still, like the surface of a motionless lake. Anyone who had known her during her military years might not recognize the woman now living alone in a modest wooden cabin, nestled among thick pine trees in rural southern Texas. The house wasn't big, but it held everything she needed. Books neatly lined on shelves, an old radio playing day and night, a small spotless kitchen, and her electric wheelchair parked beside the window where sunlight streamed through the leaves. Sarah had once lived a very different life, a soldier's life. She didn't just fight. She trained brave, intelligent dogs who had saved lives countless times by sniffing out mines or alerting her unit to hidden threats. To Sarah, those dogs weren't tools. They were teammates, loyal friends who stood beside her in war. But then, one fateful day, An explosion tore the ground beneath her feet and turned her world upside down. When she opened her eyes in a field hospital, it wasn't the pain she felt first. It was the absence. From the waist down, she was gone. Back home, she had hoped for a new beginning. But only months later, a car crash took the life of her husband, the one remaining person she still clung to. That grief pulled her into a darkness with no floor. Old friends slowly disappeared. Plans were canceled. Sympathy began to sound hollow. Wanting to avoid pity, she moved far away, far enough that no one asked questions, quiet enough that she didn't have to pretend she was okay. Her days passed in a silent loop. In the mornings, she brewed coffee and rolled onto the porch to watch the sun scatter through the trees. Afternoons were for revisiting familiar pages, though sometimes she'd read only a paragraph before staring into the space between the lines. At night, the old radio clicked to life, followed by the gravelly voice of Roy, a local host she'd never met. He shared little stories of ordinary lives and played worn-out country songs, and Sarah listened as if he were a ghostly friend sitting beside her. The house phone rang only once a week. A call from Jennifer, her VA counselor. Jennifer had a soft, unhurried voice and never asked questions that pushed too deep. "How are you holding up, Sarah?" "I'm still here." "That's enough for this week." Their calls usually ended like that. Jennifer didn't rush healing. She knew some wounds needed only time and maybe nothing else. The nearest town was 6 miles away. Not far, but Sarah rarely went. She ordered supplies online and left notes for delivery drivers to drop packages on the porch. Townsfolk still talked about her, though their words were half rumor, half truth. She used to lead a whole team of dogs in the war. "I heard she hasn't spoken to anyone in years." Poor woman. But strange, too. There was no cruelty in their voices, only confusion because they couldn't grasp what loss had done to her. But not everyone kept their distance. 2 names lingered quietly in Sarah's life: Mrs. Nora and Liam. Mrs. Nora lived closest, though it still took a car ride to reach Sarah's cabin. She'd once had a son, a Marine who never returned from the Gulf. Since then, she has lived alone, growing flowers, feeding stray cats, and baking nearly every day. She never forced friendship on Sarah, but every month she left a small bag of cookies on the porch with a note in shaky handwriting. "As long as you're alive, there's still hope, sweetheart." Sarah never replied, but she never threw them away either. Then there was Liam, a 10-year-old boy with wild curls who lived at the far end of the road. He never spoke, never knocked. He just watched from a distance. Once, Sarah caught him peeking from behind the fence, eyes following her electric wheelchair. Not afraid, just curious. She didn't scold him, just raised an eyebrow and turned away. He seemed to understand. After that, he appeared now and then, like a quiet shadow. That unspoken respect, that patient presence, it made Sarah feel seen but not intruded upon. And for her, that was enough. Life moved on like that, closed off, but not entirely numb, like a wound with scabbed skin but healing still buried deep inside. Sarah didn't know what she was waiting for, if she was waiting for anything at all, until one stifling afternoon, when even the cicadas fell silent, and something shifted in the air. She heard a sound from the woods, faint, broken, almost too small to matter, but it cut straight through the silence that had wrapped around her heart for years. A weak, choking whimper, like a soul begging to be saved. And somehow, Sarah knew she had to find that sound. The sound, faint, broken, almost lost in the hum of cicadas and the wind rustling through leaves, echoed again as Sarah guided her wheelchair down a narrow dirt path behind her cabin. It was a route she often took during stifling afternoons, a small escape from the confinement of 4 walls. At first, she thought she was imagining it. Maybe a branch snapping, some distant animal, or even a memory reverberating through her mind. But then it came again, clearer this time, choked with a pain so raw it was almost human, like the stifled cry of a creature calling into a void without hope. Sarah's heart clenched. Something stirred deep inside her. An old reflex awakened. A soldier's instinct, a dog handler's ear. She had heard sounds like that before, buried in rubble, muffled by ash and gunpowder. The desperate whimpering of life refusing to die. She stopped, turned her head, and listened again. And when the whimper came for the third time, longer now, frayed, like pain stretched to its final thread, Sarah didn't hesitate. Her wheelchair wasn't built for soft ground or tangled forest trails, but she pushed the joystick hard and veered off the path, plunging into the woods. The canopy above grew darker, branches interlacing to hide the sky, the air thick and unmoving, as though time itself had stalled beneath the trees. Leaves slapped against her arms, rocks jarred her wheels, but she didn't slow down. There was something ahead, not just a sound, but a call for help. After several minutes of pushing through brush and uneven ground, she saw it. Huddled beneath an old oak tree, where only the faintest shafts of sunlight broke through the dense foliage. A German shepherd, or what remained of one, lay motionless in the dirt, so thin its ribs protruded like a skeleton drawn in sharp lines. Its coat, once thick and proud, was now matted with mud, dried blood, and its waist. Around its neck, a rusted iron chain dragged heavily to the ground, tightly wrapped and padlocked to a metal stake driven deep into the earth. The soil around it had been torn up in every direction, a raw testament to its struggle to be free. Sarah froze, not in fear, but as a cold wave of horror slipped down her spine. She had seen dogs injured in combat, had carried them through gunfire and debris. But she had never seen anything like this. This wasn't just starvation or injury. This was intentional abandonment, cruel, calculated, and utterly indifferent. Someone had brought this dog into the woods, chained it, and walked away as if its life meant nothing. This wasn't neglect. It was a decision, the kind only a rotted soul could make. She looked around. No cabins, no tire tracks, no sign anyone had ever lived here. Just the dog and the chain. A slow, silent sentence carried out in isolation. The dog lifted its head faintly at the sound of her approach. Its eyes were dry as though it had cried itself empty, but there was still something left in them. Not hope, that had long since burned out. It was resignation, the kind of look you give the world when you've stopped asking for rescue. It didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't try to run. It just looked at her, like it was saying goodbye. And Sarah felt something squeeze in her chest. Not pity, but recognition. A quiet, powerful knowing. A bond formed in an instant between two souls who had been through too much and come out the other side broken, but still breathing. She knew that look. She'd seen it before. In the mirror. On the longest, coldest nights of her life. "Not today," Sarah murmured, her voice trembling but steady. She leaned forward, trying to reach the chain, but the chair was too low, and the angle was wrong. Her hand shook, not from weakness, but from the rage rising in her chest, not anger at herself, but at the quiet evil that had let a living being suffer like this. "God damn it!" she hissed through clenched teeth, then backed the chair away, spun it around, and turned out of the woods. Not to leave, but to return with what she needed. Dusk was falling fast. But Sarah no longer heard the cicadas. No breeze rustled the trees. Her mind was locked on the sound of wheels grinding over rock and the pounding of her heart, as if she too were racing against the last fragile flicker of life in those eyes. She didn't know why the urgency gripped her so fiercely. Maybe it was the eyes that had long learned the pain of being left behind, waiting for someone, anyone, to come back. And today, that someone would be her. As the wheelchair rolled to a stop on the front porch, the sunset had turned into a fiery red, magnificent yet urgent, like a warning flare from the sky. A life was slipping further from the edge. Sarah rushed to the door, her breath quickened not from exhaustion, but from a rare, deep restlessness. On the wall, beside the shoe rack, hung the heavy wooden cane with its brass handle, a relic she kept more out of fragile hope than habit, a belief that she could still rise if she had to. Nearby, she opened a drawer and took out the old hunting knife that had once followed her into battle, its blade worn but still sharp. It had been used to cut canvas, pry open medical kits, and sometimes to defend life amidst death. Tonight, it would be used again, not in war, but to free a soul bound by cruelty. Back in the forest, she steered the wheelchair along the rough trail, now harder to navigate in the dark. The last traces of light filtered weakly through the trees. Branches scraped her arms, dust stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. Every passing minute felt like it stole one more heartbeat from the eyes that had silently begged her to return. When she arrived, the dog was still there, head resting on the ground, body so still it made her heart lurch. For a second, Sarah feared she was too late. Then, as if stirred by her presence, an ear twitched. Slowly, the eyes opened. That gaze, dim but not yet gone, struck her chest like a blade. She moved closer, laid the knife down, and reached for her cane. Bracing herself against the dirt, she used the strength of her upper body to twist and pull herself from the chair, hands gripping a nearby tree trunk. Every muscle trembled under the strain, but her eyes never left the dog's chained neck. Inch by inch, she lowered herself until she was close enough to grab the knife again. Her hand shook slightly, but her grip was sure. She began sawing at the rusted chain, a metal curse that had dug into the dog's flesh for days, maybe weeks. Each stroke of the blade scraped across dried blood, matted fur, and the stench of rot. She dared not imagine the pain this creature had endured, starving, trapped under the burning sun, with no water, no hope, and no one returning. What broke her most was the dog's stillness, no resistance, no growl, as if it had long accepted that humans only brought pain. The chain was thick, the blade dulled, her hands bled from the effort, but Sarah kept cutting, and finally, with a brittle snap, the metal gave way. In that instant, both she and the dog collapsed onto the forest floor, Sarah drained, the dog disbelieving. It didn't run. It didn't howl. It simply lay on its side, panting, eyes wide. And in those eyes, for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker. Not life in full bloom, but a tiny spark, fragile as an oil lamp on the verge of dying, yet still alive. She reached out, gently resting her hand on its head, the first touch either had offered in a long time. The dog flinched, then slowly eased, as if deciding whether this hand was like the ones that had hurt it. But when Sarah whispered, "Not today. You're not dying here," the dog's cloudy eyes shimmered, like something long forgotten had just stirred. Maybe trust, or simply the raw instinct to survive. She stayed with it, not rushing. Her hand remained on its head, her breath sinking with its labored ones. And there, deep in the forest, beneath the old oak trees, two abandoned souls, a broken soldier and a battered four-legged fighter, found each other in the silence they both thought would last forever. They didn't know it yet, but this moment was the beginning of a journey that would change everything. By the time the sun had fully dipped behind the trees and the sky melted into a hazy blue-violet hue, flickering with scattered fireflies, Sarah gently lifted the dog in her arms. Her shoulders ached, her arms trembled, and yet she held on. Its body was so thin and brittle, it felt more like carrying a bundle of dry twigs than a living creature. In the back seat of her small truck, she laid down an old blanket and carefully placed it on its side, cradling its head against her chest as if letting go might cause its faint breath to vanish. On the drive home, she checked the rearview mirror over and over, and every time she caught the dog's eyes still open, still watching, even dimly through the dark, something in her heart tightened. It was a strange feeling, a blend of pain and tenderness, fragile and yet undeniably alive. When they got back, she didn't turn on the main lights. Just a soft amber glow from the lamp spilled across the flannel blanket she had spread by the fireplace. She cleaned the mud and blood-matted fur, trimmed away tangled clumps, and gently washed the wounds around its neck using warm water and a bottle of antiseptic she had kept from her service days. The dog didn't cry, didn't resist. It only trembled when the water touched its skin, a haunting kind of resignation, as if pain was the only language it understood from humans. When she was done and turned to fetch water, it looked up at her with hollow eyes, then let its head fall into the folded towel beneath it, utterly spent after what felt like a never-ending war. And in that quiet, Sarah whispered, not to be heard, but as if the wind itself might carry her words, "You're a fighter. You survived. Ranger. From now on, I'm calling you Ranger." The name came out like a promise, not just something to call him, but something to reclaim him from a past that would no longer define him. From that moment on, he had a name, an identity, and a teammate. But names don't heal wounds. In those early days, Ranger barely ate, managing only a few spoonfuls of thin chicken broth that Sarah left a safe distance from where he lay. Every time she approached, no matter how gently, he recoiled, shrinking into the corner with eyes that flinched the way only a creature used to violence does. Once, just the soft clink of a spoon against a bowl sent him bolting upright, panic written in every line of his body, as if he were bracing for one more fight to survive. The entire room became a silent battlefield. Sarah on one side, calm and patient, Ranger on the other, raw with fear and mistrust, and between them, a thick fog of time steeped in betrayal. Sarah never pushed. She knew too well that invisible wounds often ran deeper than the ones left by chains. Each morning, she cooked the broth, placed the bowl just far enough away not to alarm him, then sat quietly at her table with a book or the radio, pretending to be distracted but always watching. Sometimes she'd speak, softly, as if to no one, telling little stories about her time in the field, about a dog named Hero who once saved her squad from a minefield, or a friend who never came back. She didn't know if Ranger listened, but every time her voice broke the silence, his ears twitched, just a little, like leaves stirring in a gentle wind, and that tiny flicker was reason enough to keep speaking. One night, Ranger whimpered softly in his sleep, body trembling as if wrestling with a nightmare he couldn't escape. Sarah sat up, left the lights off, and placed her hand gently over the blanket covering him. "You're safe," she whispered. "I'm here. No one's going to hurt you now." Her words hovered in the dark like a quiet spell, not just to soothe him, but to remind herself too, that even the most broken kind of life can begin again if given enough patience, love, and a safe place to heal. She didn't know what the future would bring, but Sarah understood something had begun. Not loud or obvious, but in the smallest ways. A glance held a bit longer, a steadier breath, a slight wag of the tail when morning sun broke through the curtains. A fragile beginning, yes, but for two souls who had once lost everything, sometimes, that's all it takes to build a new world. Perhaps it was in that fleeting moment, when Ranger's eyes briefly met hers beneath the fading light, that something quietly ignited inside Sarah, like a tiny flame kindled in a cold, damp room. No one else could have seen it, but for her it was enough. Enough to believe that Ranger's life hadn't been extinguished yet, that behind the matted fur and the scar circling his neck, there was still a soul trying to find its way back toward the light. And so each morning after that, when the air was still brisk and cool, Sarah would wheel herself to sit a few feet away from him. She didn't speak much, didn't reach out or do anything grand. She simply was there, like a tree that stands still through storms. Her presence, gentle and consistent, became the quiet medicine Ranger didn't know he needed. She kept a routine, cooking thin chicken soup every morning, just as she once had for the injured military dogs under her care. A few finely chopped vegetables, small slices of chicken, all simmered until tender. She'd place the bowl several feet from where Ranger lay, not close enough to scare him, but near enough for the warm scent to reach him, blending with the musky air of old wood and sun-warmed dust. At first he didn't move, eyes closed, breath shallow, as if the smell of food barely registered against the weight of his exhaustion. But slowly, perhaps from a fading instinct for survival, his ears would twitch when Sarah entered. His head would tilt faintly at the sound of the spoon tapping the bowl. His eyes, once void of response, began to flick toward her in brief, cautious glances. Sarah noticed every small shift. To anyone else, it might have seemed like nothing. A twitch in sleep, a tail's faint flick, a fleeting glance. But to her, someone who had once spent years reading every micro-movement of dogs trained for war, it was all loud and clear. Ranger was listening. So she began to tell stories, not because she thought he understood, but because she needed to hear them herself, to remember the life she once had. She spoke of the first time she met Hunter, the headstrong Malinois who chewed through 3 leashes in a week, but was the first to sprint through a minefield to save a wounded soldier. She told of nights lying beside the trenches, distant shelling in the air, Hunter's steady breath warm at her side, alive, loyal, and near. She even spoke of her late husband, the man who waited for her for 4 long years, who once drove across state lines just to surprise her with a pair of handmade leather boots on her birthday. She didn't know why she told all this to Ranger, a dog too broken to respond. But as she spoke, it didn't feel like she was speaking to an animal. It felt like she was speaking to another lost soul, one who, like her, had wandered too far from the world they once knew. Between them, a language began to take shape, one without words, built from presence, patience, and small offerings, a spoonful of soup, a quiet memory, a glance held just long enough. Ranger started moving, first just his head slipping from under the old blanket, then a hesitant step toward the soup bowl, only to pull back. Later, a soft scrape of claws on the wooden floor as he crept closer in the silence of night. One morning, Sarah woke from a doze in her wheelchair to find the bowl empty, just a sheen of fat glimmering in the dawn light, and Ranger lying nearby, his head resting between his paws, eyes closed, breathing slow and steady. She didn't smile, didn't speak. She simply placed a hand over her chest, where her heart had just skipped a strange, unfamiliar beat. There was a night when the wind howled loudly and sharply against the glass, too much like gunfire. Ranger jolted up, his body trembling, eyes wide in panic. Sarah wheeled closer, not touching him, not rushing, just being there. Her voice was a whisper. "No one's going to hurt you now, I promise." Minutes passed. Ranger tilted his head slightly, didn't flinch, didn't bark, just let out a long sigh, as if finally releasing something he'd held too long. Then, slowly, he lay down again, this time with his head touching the base of her chair. From that moment on, the invisible wall between them began to melt, bit by bit, like ice cracking under spring sun. Sarah and Ranger didn't need words. Their language was breath and presence, movement and stillness, a step closer each day. And in that old wooden cabin tucked deep in the Texas countryside, 2 wounded beings were learning to exist again, not just to survive, but to believe in something bigger, something like hope, that fragile, flickering idea that maybe, just maybe, there was still a place for them in the world. In the slow mornings, when the sun hadn't yet reached the treetops behind the porch, Sarah sat quietly in her wheelchair, eyes resting on Ranger, who slept curled up beside the fireplace. It was only in that position, tucked in tightly, body wound into itself, that he seemed able to forget the world that had once turned its back on him. But even in sleep, his body sometimes twitched. A muffled whimper would slip between short, fast breaths, and his legs would jerk as if trying to flee from something nameless, haunted echoes of a past that had never truly let go. Sarah didn't need to ask. She knew that feeling all too well. She had woken in the middle of the night, soaked in sweat, to the sounds that lived only in memory. Explosions, voices shouting names across the chaos, dogs barking sharply through dust and blood. These sounds followed her into sleep, as if the battlefield had never really released her. In those restless dreams, Sarah was back in Afghanistan, beneath a searing sun and the heavy thump of helicopter blades slicing the air above her cropped hair. She stood on a makeshift training ground, leash in hand, beside Hunter, the sharp-eyed Malinois with unmatched loyalty. She signaled, and Hunter dashed ahead, sniffing decoy explosives tucked in wooden crates, every movement precise, rehearsed, flawless. Young soldiers clapped and laughed. Sarah laughed too, her eyes lit with life and purpose, with the belief that what she was doing mattered, that she was keeping her team safe. But that memory never lasted long. Suddenly, it was a patrol through red dust terrain. Hunter froze mid-step, fur bristling, gaze locked forward. A second later, everything exploded. The ground roared beneath her, lifting her into the air, then swallowing her into darkness. Not into sand, but into a heavy, soundless void packed with pain. She woke in a field hospital, fire burning through her lower body, a hollow in her chest where Hunter should have been. 3 soldiers gone. Hunter gone. And the part of her that had once been strongest was left buried in the rubble. The doctors called her survival a miracle, but Sarah never saw it that way. It felt more like a cruel trade. Her body had returned, but something vital had stayed behind. From that day on, the sound of a barking dog wasn't training. It was a knife to the memory. The love she once held for those 4-legged warriors was buried beneath a grief too deep to name. Ranger didn't sleep peacefully either. Even in this warm, safe room, his body would sometimes stiffen. His claws scratched lightly against the floor, like he was racing down a hallway filled with smoke and screams. Sarah couldn't be sure, but something in him, the alertness in his gaze, the strength in his gait when illness didn't weigh him down, the constant tension behind every movement, suggested he had once been a working dog. Maybe he, too, had had a handler, a soldier like her. Maybe he'd crossed front lines, followed commands, been praised, hugged quickly between battles. And then what happened? Had that soldier fallen? Had Ranger, without orders, without a human to trust, become disposable? Was the scar on his neck a final betrayal? The mark left not by enemies, but by the very hands that once fought beside him? Sarah couldn't know his story for certain, but something in his eyes, in the way they searched the room after every strange noise, in how he jerked awake from nightmares, told her they carried the same kind of wound. An invisible one, a memory that couldn't be named but pressed heavy on every breath. And that shared understanding, that parallel pain between 2 souls cast out of battle without warning, was slowly stitching them together. Not loudly, not quickly, but with a bond that could not be undone. One late afternoon, as Sarah spoke softly about the first time she lost a soldier under her command, her voice faltering at the mention of the blast, of the screams, of the icy cold that reached her bones, Ranger, who had been lying still, suddenly lifted his head and looked straight at her. In those deep brown eyes, the guardedness was gone. What remained was something raw and unspoken, understanding. Sarah said nothing more. Her heart beat fast, not from grief this time, but from something quieter, stronger. She knew, in that moment, they were no longer alone in their pain. From that quiet, unwavering gaze, as if Ranger had seen his reflection in Sarah's eyes, something shifted. Not a sudden jolt like a ringing bell, but more like the first soft light breaking through the mist after a storm that had lasted far too long. The next morning, as Sarah wheeled into the room with the familiar bowl of chicken soup, she found Ranger lying on his side, head slightly raised, ears perked, eyes wide open, watching her from a distance closer than usual. When she set the bowl down, there was no growling, no wary stare. He simply sat, still and calm, and after a few long seconds that stretched like lifetimes, he stepped forward, slowly, haltingly, but on his own feet. A small gesture, but for Sarah it was nothing short of a miracle. The first time Ranger chose to move toward her rather than away. From that day on, he began eating regularly. First just a few spoonfuls of soup, then small strips of shredded chicken, and eventually, the special recovery biscuits she'd ordered just for him. After eating, he no longer retreated into corners. He stayed where he was, eyes quietly following her movements across the room as if a new routine was beginning to take root. She noticed how he always angled toward the sound of her wheelchair wheels. So, on a crisp early autumn morning, as the scent of dry grass drifted into the room through an open window, Sarah smiled and rummaged through a drawer for a small silver bell, the one that used to hang from her military pack during long marches. She fastened it to the left wheel of her chair and gave it a slow turn. A soft chime rang out, delicate and clear, cutting through the long-held silence like music uncoiling in forgotten air. Ranger's head lifted immediately, ears alert, not in fear, but in focus. He leaned forward slightly, eyes lit with something that looked like understanding, like a secret game only the two of them knew how to play. "Now you'll always know where I am," Sarah said, her voice soft and warm. Ranger wagged his tail once, just a small flick, but it felt like agreement. From then on, whenever the bell rang, Ranger would stir, moving toward the sound, even if only a few steps. And when Sarah rolled onto the porch to sit quietly under the late afternoon sun, Ranger would follow and settle beside her, resting his head on her footrest, breathing evenly in a calm that no longer felt heavy. Word of Ranger, or more precisely his quiet return to life, began to spread. Not through gossip, but in the small details noticed by those who paid attention. Mrs. Nora, the silver-haired neighbor Sarah had only known through the cookies left wordlessly on her doorstep, appeared again, this time carrying a bundle of still-warm beef bones wrapped in a faded floral handkerchief. She didn't ask questions. She just smiled, placed the bundle down and said, "Heard you've got a new friend. Maybe he'll like bones as much as my old ones did." Sarah nodded, thanked her, and for the first time in years, they stood and spoke for a few minutes at the door. Not awkwardly, but like two women who had both lost too much and were slowly finding somewhere to put what gentleness they had left. After that day, Nora began stopping by more often, sometimes with almond butter cookies, sometimes with half-finished knitting in her basket. She never asked about Sarah's past, never touched the heavy things everyone knew, but no one dared to say aloud. Instead, she told stories about her garden, about a stray cat named Whiskey, who'd slept at her feet all last winter. And Sarah listened, not for the stories themselves, but for Nora's voice, steady, calm, like a lifeline tossed across the stormy sea of memory. Even Ranger began to accept other presences. He didn't hide when Nora entered, didn't growl or retreat. He simply watched, head tilted slightly, eyes alert but no longer afraid. Once, when Nora knelt to place a plate of biscuits under the table, Ranger approached, sniffed the hem of her skirt. And then, something Sarah had never expected, Nora reached down, stroked his head and said, "Good boy." Ranger closed his eyes, didn't pull away, as if that hand had tapped gently on a long-shut door in his memory. And so, piece by piece, small things began to thread together, a fragile cord reconnecting Sarah to the world outside, a cord she had once thought she'd never need again. But in healing a wounded creature, she had unknowingly reopened her own heart, letting in the light, soft and persistent like the autumn sun warming the wooden porch. Now the cabin was no longer filled only with the creak of wheels. It held the light jingle of a silver bell, the steady breathing of a dog who no longer flinched. And sometimes something else. Quiet laughter, the kind Sarah had forgotten she was still capable of, the kind she thought had been lost somewhere in the war. But it hadn't been lost. It had only been waiting for this moment, this bond, this return to life. The days that followed passed like a thread pulled slowly through torn fabric, not rushed, but steady. And in that gentle, fragile rhythm, Sarah began to feel something she hadn't in a long time, that she was no longer alone in her quiet war with the shadows inside her. Ranger was no longer just a rescued dog. He had become part of the pulse of her daily life. The familiar sound of claws clicking across wooden floors, the warm breath curled beside her wheelchair, the steady eyes that followed every soft chime of her silver bell. But even on the calmest days, pain had its way of returning. Sometimes not as dreams, but as sharp neurological attacks, sudden spasms from the damaged nerves in her lower back that Sarah rarely spoke about. That night, a light rain fell. Droplets tapped gently against the porch roof, and the fire in the hearth glowed faintly in the corner of the room. Sarah had fallen asleep in the small bed beside the window, her breathing slow and even after a full day of cooking, tidying, and writing a few quiet lines in her journal. Ranger lay curled at the foot of the bed, his head resting on an old pillow, eyes closed but ears alert, as if still standing guard over a sleep that was never quite peaceful. The night deepened, and the house fell still, only the rain and the soft hiss of wind seeping through the cracks in the old wood. Sometime after midnight, a low groan broke the silence. Sarah's eyes opened, but her body did not respond. A searing pain surged from her lower spine up through her chest, like thousands of needles piercing her spinal cord, locking her muscles in a state of numb agony. She tried to move her hand, but it only reached the edge of the pillow. Her vision blurred with pain. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She knew this kind of spasm. It had taken her to the emergency room twice before, and she knew what she needed. The emergency injection stored in the drawer beside her bed, the only thing that could stop the paralysis from spreading. But the distance, barely an arm's length, now felt like a world away. Ranger shot up. He hadn't needed a call, not a word, not even a clear groan, just instinct, the same one that once saved lives on battlefields, telling him something was wrong. Sarah felt the bed shift, then the weight of Ranger landing beside her, his front paws pressing gently on her chest, cold nose nudging her cheek, fast, anxious licks, followed by a short, urgent bark. Not loud, but unmistakably sharp. "Ranger!" she tried to whisper, but only a gasp came out. The pain didn't lessen. Her hand shook, reaching for the drawer, still too far. Ranger barked again, then, as if understanding exactly what she was trying to do, he leapt off the bed, rounded to the other side, and pushed the drawer with his paw. On the second try, it slid open. Without hesitation, he clamped his teeth around the small fabric pouch holding the injector and carried it back to her. With the last of her strength, Sarah grasped the pouch, pulled out the syringe, and injected it into her thigh, right where the doctor had shown her. Sweat streamed down her face. Her breathing came in sharp bursts. Her eyes stung, but slowly, the pain began to ease, receding like a tide pulling back from the shore. Ranger lay close, unmoving, his head resting on her stomach. His eyes are half closed, ears pressed to her chest as if listening for the slow, faint beat of a heart returning from the edge. Sarah raised her hand and rested it on his back, her fingers brushing the thick fur that had finally grown back after months of healing. She didn't say, "Thank you." The words felt too small. Instead, she whispered, barely more than breath, "Good boy, you saved me." And in that moment, without ceremony, something unspoken and irreversible was forged between them. A bond deeper than gratitude or friendship. A connection born of life itself, sealed in the moment death had nearly arrived. That night, Sarah didn't fall back asleep. But she wasn't alone. Ranger didn't leave her side, lying there like a soldier beside his commander. But not out of duty, out of love, out of something far older and quieter than orders. He was a creature once abandoned, now guarding another life. And from that night forward, they were no longer the rescuer and the rescued. They were comrades, not in the old war, but in a new one. The silent, steady fight of two souls learning how to live again. As the first light of morning filtered softly through the window, A pale golden streak fell across the blanket where Ranger still lay close beside her. Sarah opened her eyes after a sleepless night and felt something she hadn't in years. Not pain, not exhaustion, but a sense of being alive. Fully, clearly, undeniably. Her hand was still resting on Ranger's back, rising and falling with his steady breath, warmer and more grounding than anything she'd known after so many years buried in cold silence. She turned her head slightly, her eyes no longer blurred by tears, and whispered, this time in a voice firm and sure, like a truth being spoken aloud for the first time. "You just saved me, Ranger." It wasn't said as a passing thought. It was a declaration, a quiet, irreversible shift. From that moment on, Ranger wasn't just a dog she'd rescued from chains and abandonment. He was a comrade, a fellow soldier, a companion who had fought beside her, not with weapons or commands, but with unwavering presence and instinct that cut through the dark without needing words. Just like Hunter had, long ago, Ranger sensed danger before it had a name. He had acted, not because anyone told him to, but because something deeper had taken root. A bond shaped by trust, by time spent side by side, by eyes that recognized each other across layers of unspoken memory. From that day, everything between them changed. Not in grand gestures, but in quiet understanding woven into the smallest of acts. Ranger no longer simply followed the sound of the silver bell. He began to anticipate Sarah's patterns, reading her needs without prompting. He'd position himself on her dominant side when she wheeled toward the door, lie close beside her whenever she stopped to rest, and especially, he was always watching on days when her fatigue ran deeper than usual. It was as if he had chosen his mission, to protect this woman, not with teeth, but with presence, with unwavering, silent loyalty. Sarah felt the change in herself, too. She no longer avoided her neighbor's glances when she rolled out onto the porch. She no longer flinched at a knock on the door, because now she knew she was never truly alone. Once, while cleaning the kitchen, she dropped a glove. She bent instinctively, risking a sharp jolt of pain in her back. But before she could reach for it, Ranger padded over, picked it up gently in his mouth, and laid it on her lap as if he had been born to do just that. The change didn't stop with them. Like ripples on water, it reached outward. Mrs. Nora, still faithfully bringing by cookies and quiet stories, now stayed a little longer. Sometimes she sat with Sarah on the porch steps, holding a warm cup of tea, watching Ranger chase after a golden leaf spinning in the breeze. Once, Nora said with a slow, thoughtful sigh, "Some dogs don't need words to know what people need. Ranger's one of those. And so are you, Sarah." They had stepped into a new rhythm, not led by the past, but by a present that was, day by day, becoming something healing. Sarah began to journal again, noting each small shift, the way Ranger reacted to the distant wail of an ambulance, how he slowed his pace when her wheelchair caught on uneven ground, how he lay by the bed each night, never leaving, as if still guarding her from the memory of the night that had bonded them in something stronger than fate. To Sarah, Ranger was more than a companion. He was living proof of something she had once been too afraid to believe, that even after everything had collapsed, something new could be built. Something steadier, not from stone or certainty, but from the smallest acts of trust, repeated day after day. And in that quiet world, where wheelchair wheels squeaked on wooden floors, where a silver bell rang softly with every turn, where a dog's breath blended with the measured pace of an old soldier's new life, something had truly come alive again. Not grand, just real point, since the bond between them had become something no longer abstract, but living, breathing, present in every shared breath, every quiet touch. Sarah began to notice something stirring inside her. It surprised her. The old instinct to train, long buried with her folded uniform in the wooden chest in the corner of the room, was reawakening. Not as duty, but as desire. A quiet longing to build something again. To breathe life into something familiar, but softer, more enduring. And Ranger, with eyes always alert for her slightest sigh, always attentive when she lingered too long at the window, seemed to be inviting her to begin. It was a journey she knew by heart. But this time it wasn't for war. It was for life. She started small, on purpose. Dropping a glove onto the floor, she gave no command. Just a glance toward Ranger, then a pointed finger toward the object near the base of her chair. Ranger tilted his head as if pulling a memory from somewhere deep within. Then he stepped forward, gently picked up the glove in his mouth, and placed it on her lap. No praise was needed. No treats, just a soft smile and a hand on his head. In that moment, the long stretch of years, the weight of all that had been lost, was momentarily filled by a single, simple act built entirely on trust. The next exercises didn't happen in a day. They stretched over mornings soaked in golden light and breezy afternoons, where the silver bell chimed gently with each roll of her wheels. She placed objects at varying heights: a remote, a hand towel, a lightweight water bottle. She paired short, calm verbal cues with clear hand gestures, just like she used to with Hunter in the old unit. At first, Ranger hesitated. Sometimes he picked up the wrong item or paused, looking at her as if to ask, "Was that right?" But over time, without scolding or pressure, he grew more confident, more precise. Eventually, he began to pick up things she dropped without being asked, reading her movements, her needs, as if by instinct. Sarah felt a deep emotion rise when she noticed him check the door each night. Small as it was, it felt like a silent vow. "I'll watch while you sleep." She installed a clear plastic panel on the lower window pane so Ranger could put his paws up and see outside. She taught him to give a single short bark when he noticed anything unusual. One morning, when Mrs. Nora arrived earlier than usual, Ranger gave the signal before the doorbell rang. Sarah laughed, caught off guard and proud. "You're a real soldier," she said softly. Ranger wagged his tail, eyes steady, as if to say, "I was. I still am. If someone believes I can be." Soon after, Sarah installed a red emergency button near the front door, a large, easy-to-press switch that could be activated with a simple nudge. She began teaching Ranger how to press it with his nose in case of an emergency. A few bits of sausage, patient encouragement, and eye contact filled with faith were all it took. Within days, Ranger had learned to press it whenever Sarah pretended to fall or cried out in mock pain. With each successful exercise, the little cabin felt warmer, less like a hiding place, more like a training ground, not for combat, but for reclaiming the parts of herself she'd once thought too broken to use again. The ghosts of memory didn't vanish, but they began to shift, from haunting to healing, from weight to material. Sarah never called Ranger my dog. In her late-night journal entries, she always used one word: teammate. There was no other way to describe a creature who sensed her distress before she could voice it, who learned not for reward but from a sacred, silent bond forged in shared survival. Ranger was no longer a dog who had been left behind. He was the reason Sarah moved through her days with purpose again, the living witness of her rebirth, the quiet proof that a soldier could still matter, even when she believed her role in the world was done. And so, as the wind drifted through the old wooden door and long slants of afternoon sun stretched across the floor, a soldier and a four-legged warrior healed. Gesture by gesture, task by task, glance by glance, not to return to the battlefield, but to walk forward into life, with all the courage and quiet grace that only the forgotten can give one another. In the quiet afternoons, after training sessions had ended, and Sarah and Ranger sat resting under the porch roof, listening to the wind rustle through the old pines and the silver bell chiming softly with each shift of her wheels, she began to notice a small figure flickering in and out of view behind the distant fence. At first it was just a feeling, a clumsy rustle of leaves, a too loud footstep, but by the third day she saw clearly. Liam, the boy from down the road, with his tousled curls and bright, curious eyes, crouched behind a bush, knees hugged to his chest, watching Ranger with open fascination. Sarah wasn't surprised. She had seen that look before, not just in children but in adults too, the gaze of someone who didn't yet understand but was drawn in by something quietly extraordinary. Sometimes it was curiosity. Sometimes it was a quiet form of admiration for a creature they instinctively knew was different. But this time, that gaze didn't make Sarah retreat. She didn't wave him off, didn't shut the door like she once might have. She simply looked at him, just long enough for Liam to know he'd been seen but not sent away. And instead of running, Liam hesitated, then slowly stepped out from the bushes, nervously twisting the hem of his shirt, cheeks red. "I just wanted to see the dog," he mumbled. "I didn't mean to bother you." Ranger, resting his chin on Sarah's feet, immediately perked up. His ears twitched, his eyes narrowed, his back arched slightly, not aggressive, but alert. A low growl hummed from his throat, not a threat, but a warning. "This is my space, and I don't know who you are." Sarah laid a gentle hand on his back, her voice low and steady, the way she used to speak to dogs on their first uneasy day of training. "It's all right, Ranger. The boy's not an enemy." Ranger looked at her, then at Liam, tilting his head to the side, his familiar signal that he was processing. Under Sarah's calm gaze, Liam took a cautious step closer, then sat down about 3 meters away, legs crossed, hands folded in his lap like a student waiting to be called on. In the days that followed, Liam kept returning, first lingering behind the fence, then sitting quietly on the porch, and eventually helping with small tasks, carrying the basket by the stove, handing Sarah firewood. He didn't ask many questions, but his eyes never left Ranger, as if trying to understand something deeper than anyone had ever explained to him. Ranger kept his distance, but the growls stopped. One afternoon, when Liam placed a piece of dried sausage near his feet and stepped back, Ranger walked over, sniffed it, and ate it, calmly, without turning away like before. Sarah said nothing but silently marked it in her mind. The first time Ranger accepted someone outside their circle without needing her reassurance. Liam, with the quiet honesty only a child can bring, never tried to claim or control Ranger like a pet. He simply existed, the third presence in the tiny world Sarah and Ranger had been slowly building. He began helping with little chores, clearing dishes, collecting the mail from the roadside box, even reading aloud a few pages from the book on Sarah's nightstand. To Sarah, these tiny gestures were the beginning of something important, the slow reopening of a door she had long believed was permanently shut. A door to the outside, a door to people, a world that maybe wasn't always dangerous, a world where kindness could still show up, sometimes in the form of a boy with dirty hands and a voice that still stumbled over big words. One afternoon, as Liam played in the front yard with a stick, Ranger suddenly approached, took the end of the stick gently in his mouth, tugged at it, and then let go, an invitation to play tug-of-war. Liam's eyes widened. He looked to Sarah for permission, and when she nodded, his face lit up with the kind of pure, ringing laughter the old porch hadn't heard in years. Ranger wagged his tail, lowered his front legs to the ground. "Ready." Sarah watched them, something warm rising in her chest, something sharp catching in her throat, because sometimes rebirth doesn't begin with a dramatic transformation. Sometimes it starts with a small game, between a dog who had once lost faith and a boy who hadn't yet learned how. That afternoon when Ranger played tug-of-war with Liam didn't just bring back the first sound of laughter after years of silence. It also opened another door inside Sarah, a door she'd thought was sealed forever, the need to share. As she watched Ranger lower his head, tail wagging gently beneath Liam's wide-eyed joy, then glance back at her as if to check, "Am I doing okay?" Influential Sarah felt it clearly. Something was happening here, something real, something quietly extraordinary. And maybe, she thought, this quiet miracle unfolding in her old wooden house wasn't meant to be kept to herself. That evening, after Liam had gone home, and Ranger lay curled asleep beneath the table, Sarah sat at her long, neglected laptop, wiped away the dust, opened a blank page, and began typing without any plan. My name is Sarah Martin. I used to be a sergeant in the military. Now I'm a woman in a wheelchair living with a dog that once got left behind, and somehow the two of us are learning how to live again. She named the blog Pause and Purpose, a gentle play on words. Pause, as in slowing down, and pause, as in the quiet steps of a dog. It was a reminder that sometimes, in life's stillest moments, we rediscover our reason to keep going. At first, she wrote only for herself, to capture scattered memories, small lessons with Ranger, moments like the way he barked when Liam fell off his bike, or how he opened the door on days when Sarah was too exhausted to reach it. Then one morning, she posted her first photo, Ranger lying beside her wheelchair, head resting on the wheel, eyes half closed in the sunlight. Beneath it, she shared a journal line. He used to trust no one, so did I. But now we watch over each other. No one expected what came next. Within days, the post had been shared hundreds of times, then thousands. Sarah's once empty inbox overflowed, messages from fellow veterans, quietly thanking her for putting into words what they never could. Notes from people living with depression, autism, and grief say they cried when they saw the look in Ranger's eyes. Dog lovers from all over the world wrote stories of their animals, silent companions who had saved them when no one else saw. One former Special Forces operator sent a photo of his late service dog with a single line. "I never told anyone I cried when he died, until I read your story." A 16-year-old girl from Colorado wrote, "I hadn't left my bed in 3 weeks, but today I walked into the yard just to sit beside my dog, because I wanted him to have the same chance Ranger had." Sarah hadn't expected her voice to echo so loudly. She began sharing more, short clips of Ranger bringing her gloves, photos of Liam drawing on the porch while Ranger lay nearby, and excerpts from the notebook she wrote in every night. Even memories from the battlefield, not in graphic detail, but enough for others who'd lived through darkness to recognize themselves. None of the posts were dramatic. None were self-pitying. They simply were. Honest, soft,